Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Ayin Gimel, Daf 73 of Masechta Pesachim. What can I tell you about Daf 73? It's thorough. We got to work through it. I don't think it's going to be quite as substantial as yesterday, but you do have to sort of be focused, the shtickle. And we begin the daf talking about what happens when you write shachatosh lo ochlav. If you slaughter korban pesach on Shabbos for people that are unable to eat it. So we said in the Mishnah that you'll be chayav korban chatas. So we start off discussing that sugya. We then get into the sugya of Mekalkel bahabura, which is really a sugya from Masechta Shabbos, and then we get into this. Complex sugya of akeera. We mentioned it yesterday a little bit as well, in terms of when you have one kind of a korban and then it sort of morphs into another kind of a korban. Can that happen automatically, or do you specifically have to have intention to change the type of a korban? And that will really take us to the end of the daf, which is also the end of the 6th parak of Masechta Pesachim. Tomorrow we will be beginning the 7th parak, which is pretty exciting. We're really moving along over here in Masechta Pesachim. So now we're on Daf Ayin Gimel, 3 lines from the top. Shachtosh lo ochlav. So the Mishnah had said that if Pesach is Erev Shabbos, and so you're shechting the korban. What did I just say? If Erev Pesach is on Shabbos, and now you're shechting the korban Pesach. So if you shecht it for people who are unable to eat the korban Pesach, right? Let's say they're sick or whatever, zakin v'chole. So then you would be chayav a korban chatas. Now the Gemara says obviously be chayav a korban chatas. Pshita kevin da'asum pasul alcha chayav. No, we said in Talmud Nishchat, we said earlier that if you shech the korban Pesach for people who are unable to eat it, so then it's a pasul korban Pesach, and therefore if it's a pasul korban Pesach, well then you'd be chayav a korban chatas for slaughtering it on Shabbos, right? Everyone agrees, right? Makes sense. So mishum detana seifa pater tana reisha chayav. Okay, so the Gemara wants to sort of give an answer and say, well, because if we keep on reading in the Mishnah, it says that if you shech the korban Pesach for people who are unable to eat it, but also for people who are able to eat it, so then you'd be pater. So that's why it also says that if you slaughter the korban Pesach for people who are unable to eat it alone, you'll be chayav a korban chatas. But v'hanami pshita mishum da'asum kasher acha pater. To which the Gemara says, but that's also obvious, because we said also, we're in the same place where we said that if you slaughter korban Pesach for people who are unable to eat it, you will be chayav a korban chatas. We also said no, it will be pasul. We also said that if you slaughter korban Pesach for a group that's comprised of people who are unable to eat it, but also people who are able to eat it, so it will be a kosher korban Pesach. And therefore, over here, where it's Shabbos, if it's a kosher korban Pesach, you're not going to be chayav, you're going to be pater. So this is also obvious. How come we needed the Mishnah to tell us that if you slaughter a korban Pesach on Shabbos for a group of people comprised of people who are able to eat it and unable to eat it, you'll be pater? That's obvious. It's a kosher korban Pesach. Ella, I did the Tana, shachato shelo l'shmo, b'Shabbos tananami shelo la'ochlav. So the Gemara answers that the reason why the Mishnah had to mention shelo la'ochlav, even though it's really not necessary, because we know if it's entirely shelo la'ochlav, you can be chayav a korban chatas. We know if it's a group of la'ochlav and shelo la'ochlav, you'll be pater. The reason why we mentioned the whole ochlav thing is because we wanted to teach in the Mishnah the first part of the Mishnah, which was that if you shech the korban Pesach shelo l'shmo, and whether it's a Pesach shelo l'shmo or shlam shechachtu l'shem Pesach, that whole sugya. So then we also mentioned the ochlav v'shelo l'ochlav v'gufa l'amali. But even that, how come the Mishnah had to teach us the whole lishma thing? Same logic. If we already know that if you shech the korban Pesach shelo l'shma, so it's going to be pasul. So then, Memela on Shabbos will be chayav a korban chatas. So mishum de kabay lefluge Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua. Well, it's because the Mishnah wanted to get into the details of the machlokas between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer. That is why we mentioned it here in the context of Shabbos. Okay, very, very beautiful stuff. Says Rav Huna bar Chinina to his son Ki'azas L'kamed Reb Zrika. When you go before Reb Zrika, Vayimine, ask him, the Divrei Omer Mekalkel bahabura potter. So according to the Manda Omer, who says in Masechta Shabbos, the Mekalkel bahabura, that if you destroy something, right, if you make a chabura, if you make an animal, I guess anybody, bleed, but there's no positive spin to the bleeding, it's just negative, well then you're potter, because you didn't do any positive activity. Well then well then when we say that if you slaughter a korban pesach for people who are unable to eat it, so you can be chayav a korban chatas, why? What benefit, what positive spin is there to this situation? You slaughtered a korban pesach for a bunch of people who are unable to eat it. It's pasul. Why are you chayav a korban chatas? What positive value did you bring? Tikanim alu lo yerdu. The positive value is that, well, even if you slaughtered that korban pesach and it's pasul because it's shalol ochlav, the emurin, the parts of the korban pesach that would go on the mizbeach, they stay on the mizbeach. You don't have to take them off, and therefore, even though the korban pesach is pasul, there was still the positive value of the emurin that went on the mizbeach. Okay. Shachtov nimtza ba'mum chayev matiken. Okay, and what about though in a case where if you slaughter the korban pesach and then it turns out that it had a blemish that would make it unfit, and we say that you're chayav a korban chatas because you should have inspected it first. What positive value is there to that? Because a korban that has a ba'mum, a korban that has a blemish, the emurim do not go on the mizbeach. Well, tikim bedokin sheba'ayin v'ali b'darbi kiva da'amrim alu lo yerdu. Well, the positive value would be if the blemish that we're talking about has to do with some blemish in the eye, that this particular blemish in the eye, I think it's the eyelid. So I think that was specifically the whole story in Masechta Gittin with the korban that they brought. That was part of the whole scheme to create a headache. But anyways, this type of mum in the doken sheba'ayin is, according to Rabbi Akiva, if this animal that had this particular type of blemish in the eye went on the mizbeach, you would leave it there. So therefore, if there was a blemish, if the blemish that we're talking about in the korban pesach was doken sheba'ayin, so we're going to say you're chayav korban chatas because you should have checked it out in advance. And the added value is that according to Rabbi Akiva, you would leave it on the mizbeach. Okay, the emurin. Shachtov nimtza treifa b'seis potter. So we say that if you slaughter the korban pesach and it turns out to be a treifa, right, it was going to die within 12 months. So if that treifa, if that issue that was going to cause it to die within 12 months was hidden, there was no way to have known that externally, so then you're potter. But if it's something that you could have noticed on your own, I don't know, maybe it had like a big wound or something like that, and it was clear that it wasn't going to last a year. So then if you slaughter the korban pesach that has this big wound, or it's a treifa begalui, so then you will be chayev a korban chatas if you slaughter this korban pesach. But matikin, what value did you add? So tikin lo simidei nevela. The positive value that you added is that now it won't be a nevela, which is interesting. Of course, we know from earlier Gemaras that a nevela, an animal that died by some means other than shchita, is an avatuma. It'll be mitame adam, v'kelim. So, the positive value here, when you shech this treifa, is that at least, even though you can't put it on the mizbeach and you can't eat it or anything like that, it won't be a nevela, it won't be mitame, and that's the positive value that you add here by shechting a treifa. Okay? And that's why you be chayav a korban chatas for shechting a korban pesach, that's a treifa on Shabbos. Maskif l'Ravina. Ravina asks a kasha, Hadatanya, that which we learn in the Brisa, Sheichet chatas b'Shabbos b'chutz la'azara. Sounds pretty bad. somebody who slaughters a korban chatas on Shabbos, outside of the Beis HaMikdash, or outside of the Azara, for Avodah Zarah. Man, 3 strikes. You slaughtered a korban chatas on Shabbos, which you're not allowed to do, outside of the Azara, which you're not allowed to do, for Avodah Zarah, which you're certainly not allowed to do. Chayiv aleh gimel chatos, you chayiv 3 korban chatases. Why? Matiken. What added value is there over there? And points out Rashi that when you slaughter Avodah Zarah, so then even the tumah doesn't go away. Meaning, so the tumas nevela isn't like a thing. It's gonna be tummy. So what positive value add was there? So Amar Rav Avira shemotzio midei ever min achai. So Rav Avira says, well, at least at this point it won't be ever min achai. If a non-Jew eats this animal that was slaughtered as a korban chatas outside of the Azara on Shabbos for Avodah Zarah, so if a non-Jew eats that meat, it won't be considered like he violated one of the 7 mitzvahs of Ever Min Achai. Okay? I guess the same would apply to a Jew as well. It wouldn't be Ever Min... Well, no. The difference would, of course, be that Jews can't eat it. But can a non-Jew eat a korban that was shechted for Avodah Zarah? I don't know, mistam or not. But okay, at least, certainly at this point, Ever Min Achai won't apply because this animal is pretty dead. Speaking about Ever Min Achai, I'm just remembering that discussion we had with our friend Reb Jeffrey back on Daf Tzadi of Masechta Shabbos. Good times. That was a long time ago already. Well, Shachto v'noda v'chulei. So, who could tell me what this is talking about? Because I don't know. Well, I better figure it out quick. The Mishnah has said that if you slaughter the korban Pesach on Shabbos, and it's Erev Pesach, and right, and then you find out that all the people in the group joined the group disbanded, and they all joined some other group, and so now you have a korban Pesach that doesn't have any group associated with it. So we say that the person who slaughtered it on Erev Pesach on Shabbos is going to be patur because he didn't know. Although we're going to see at the very end actually that there is an ukimta where maybe if he knew, whatever it is, the assumption for now is he didn't know. The shochet shechted the korban Pesach, and then it turns out that the group disbanded, so he's going to be patur. Now, here comes this new sugya of ba'i akeera or lo ba'i akeera. That basically when this has come up, it came up a little bit yesterday, but also it has come up a few times in different shapes and forms, which is like, for example, the korban Pesach. So on any other day of the year is a shlamim, right? So memela, if it's not Erev Pesach, so the animal that you set aside as a korban Pesach becomes a shlamim. So the question is, does it ba'i akeera? Do you actually need to then sort of redesignate it as a shlamim, or does it just kind of automatically become a shlamim? And this is kind of the sugya that we're going to get into now, although beginning within the context of an asham. So, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav. It says Rav Huna, in the name of his Rebbe, Rav, asham shenitak l're'iyah. So if you have a korban asham, okay, fine, for whatever reason, maybe me'ila, whatever it is, you have a korban asham. Now, for whatever reason, you ended up bringing a different korban asham. I don't know why. You had to bring one korban asham. You set aside an animal to be your korban asham. I don't know why, but you ended up setting aside an additional animal as a korban asham and offering that second one. So what happens to the first one? So the answer is, what you do is yira ad she'istayv. What you do is you put it out to graze. You can't do anything with it. You already set it aside to be an asham, so you can't eat it or anything like that. And you can't designate it as some other korban. It's basically stuck. So what you do is you let it go out and graze. Eventually you hope it'll get a mum. I guess you probably hope it'll get a mum quicker, sooner rather than later. And then once it gets a mum, so it wouldn't be able to be brought as a korban in any event. So at that point you can redeem it onto money, and then you can slaughter the animal. If it's now chulin, you can slaughter it and eat it, or sell it, or whatever. Now, what do you do with that money? So that money you take to the Beis HaMikdash, and you can use it to purchase, you basically donate it to the public funds that is used to purchase what's called an olas keitza mizbeach. A korban ola, basically you would always want to make sure that there was some animal being burned on the mizbeach in the Beis HaMikdash. You don't want the mizbeach to just be like sitting there unused. That wouldn't be very nice. So we always want to make sure that there's some kind of animal burning dartin. So there is this fund for these olas that if for whatever reason there was no korban to be burned right now, they would use these funds to buy an animal and sacrifice it and burn it on the mizbeach. That's what's called olas keitza mizbeach. So if you have this asham that you had set aside to be your korban asham, for whatever reason you brought a different korban asham, so this original one, you wait for it to get a mum. You could then, let's say, sell it, take the money, and use that, donate it to Beis HaMikdash. It'll be used to buy this olas keitza mizbeach. The case that we're talking about is, what if you had this asham, but instead of sending it out to graze, whatever, you just slaughtered it, and you slaughtered it stam. You didn't have any specific intention. So initially it was this asham. You ended up slaughtering it without any particular intention. And what we're going to see that Rav Huna says in the name of Rav, that it'll work for an olas keitza mizbeach. You can offer it. You could just say, oh, okay, I shechted this korban. Let's use it as an olas keitza mizbeach. Because ultimately, what were you waiting for? You're going to let it graze. It was going to get a mum. You were going to sell it. The money was going to become an olas keitza mizbeach. So you basically just cut out a whole bunch of steps. You shechted the korban pes. You shechted this korban asham, which, was already offered with a different animal, whatever. So says Rav Huna in the name of Rav, you could just use it for the olas keitza mizbeach, cut out the middle steps, and that would be acceptable. Now remember, he's shechting it stam. He didn't particularly necessarily even have intention that he was shechting this once upon a time shlamim. Did I say shlamim? I meant asham. As in olas keitza mizbeach. But we're just saying it nonetheless works for an olas keitza mizbeach, which means that lo ba'i akeera. He didn't have to have specific intention that I'm, changing this animal from an asham to a olas keitza mizbeach. It just kind of happens on its own. Once already you offer a different animal for your asham, so memela, the first one on its own, becomes an olas keitza mizbeach, since that's ultimately where things are going. Now, Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav, says Rav Huna in the name of Rav, asham shenitak l're'iyah. So if you have this korban asham, that for whatever reason you had offered a different animal as an asham instead, and you had already designated this one as an asham, so you're kind of stuck. Shenitak l're'iyah. So what you do is you have to send it out to go graze. V'shachat ostam. But before waiting for it to develop a blemish, you slaughter it, and not with any particular intention. You just slaughter this animal. Kosher la'ola, you'd be allowed to use it for this olas keitza mizbeach, because ultimately, what were you waiting for? For it to get a mum, then you would sell it, use the money, take the money, donate it to the Beis HaMikdash, they would use it for olas keitza mizbeach. So you basically cut out the middle steps. Akeera, so we see that Rav apparently holds lo ba'i akeera, that you don't need to actively change the animal from an asham to a olas keitza mizbeach. It just kind of happens on its own, and therefore when you slaughtered this animal without any particular intention, we say you can use it for olas keitza mizbeach. If that's the case, ki lo nitak nami. Well, if that's the case, then even if you didn't specifically send it out to go graze and get a mum before you slaughtered it, then still, once already you offer the other animal as your asham, so memela, this one, that the best you can hope for is that it becomes an olas keitza mizbeach. Why can't you immediately slaughter it stam, and then it'll become an olas keitza mizbeach? Why do I have to first send it out specifically to go graze? So my answer is, that's a good question. The answer is gezer la'achar kapara atu lifnei kapara, that technically speaking, that should work, because at this point it can no longer be an asham or anything else. All it can be is an olas keitza mizbeach. So technically, yeah, even before sending it out, if you slaughtered it, it could work as an olas keitza mizbeach. But we're concerned that if you slaughter the korban before you send it out, then you might end up doing the same in a situation where you didn't get a kapara with a different animal. Meaning, because basically we're concerned about if you set aside an animal to be an asham, and it's just waiting to be an asham, and you didn't offer some other animals the asham, meaning this is supposed to be your korban asham, we're concerned that you might end up slaughtering it with intention of some other animal, even in that case, where certainly it's not allowed. So therefore, even in a case where you offered some other animal, and the memela, this first animal is unusable for anything, and theoretically you should be able to slaughter it and use it as an olas ketz mizbeach, we say nonetheless, don't do that until you first sent it out to go graze, because we're concerned that in cases where you don't offer some other animal as your asham, and this one is supposed to be your asham, we don't want you to end up slaughtering it for some other korban. And where do we see that this is like a thing, that we're concerned that we make a akeera of la'achar kapara atu lifnei kapara, right? Where you got kapara elsewhere, we make a akeera because of cases where you didn't get a kapara elsewhere. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, asham shemesu bailav, if you have a korban asham that its owners died, oshin iskapru bailav, or for whatever reason the owners offered some other animal as an asham instead. So what do you do with this initial asham, with this initial animal that was designated as an asham? As we said, yir achi yistayv, let it graze until it gets a mum, v'yimacher, and then you'll sell the animal, v'yivludarim of linadava, and then the money that you received for selling the animal, you will donate to the temple collection for these olas ketz mizbeachs. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yamus. Rabbi Eliezer says no, it's like a korban chatas. Right, a korban chatas, if in the similar case you would have to kill it, right? If a different korban chatas was offered instead, so then you would kill the original one. The same thing over here also with the ashram, that if you, for whatever reason, offered a different ashram, or as we see, that if the original owners died, so then what do you do with the original animal? So you kill it. Rabbi Yeshua Omer Yimacher. Rabbi Yeshua says essentially very similar to the Tanakama, which is sell, right? Let it go out and graze, and then when it gets a mum, you sell it via bidam of ola, and bring with the money that you get for selling it a korban ola, like an olas ketz mizbeach. Rashi points out that there's like technical differences between Rabbi Yeshua and the Tanakama, even though they seem to be saying the same thing. So we see that specifically with its money, you donate that to the Beis HaMikdash, but don't just go and slaughter this asham immediately. How come you're not, so if you have this asham that, let's say, you brought a different animal instead, so what do you do with the original? So it says, Rabbi Yeshua, you have to let it graze, and then when it gets a mum, you sell it and take the money, right? That whole process, don't immediately just shecht it, because we're concerned that if you shecht it immediately, then you may end up also slaughtering other animals that should really just be brought as a korban. You might end up slaughtering it for some other korban, and that would not be allowed. So therefore we say, at least let it go out and graze before slaughtering it. Okay, and now for the rest of the daf, and I guess technically the rest of the perek, we're going to be discussing this concept that Rav seems to be holding of, which is lo bai akeera, that you had this korban asham, and then you offered some other korban asham instead. So now the original one, we're saying that if you sent it out to go graze, and then you slaughter it stam, you just slaughter it, so it can be used as an ola. So even though you didn't specifically uproot this animal from being an ashram and saying, I'm going to now shecht it as an ola, you just shechted it stam, with no particular intention, and memele it became an ola. So we see that according to Rav, you don't need to uproot the animal from what it originally was, lo bai akeera. So now basically the rest of the daf, we're going to be going back and forth about lo bai akeera, how do we understand this? Eis ve Rav Chizda, so Rav Chizda asked Akasha li Rav Huna. Right, so Rav Chizda asked Akasha on Rav Huna. So our Mishnah said that if you slaughter the korban Pesach, and then it turns out that the group had abandoned the korban Pesach, so we say that the person who slaughtered the korban Pesach is going to be potter, because he didn't know that they abandoned the korban Pesach at the time that he slaughtered it. Now, V'tani Allah, Now, we teach about this halacha, that b'chol ki agavni yisarif miyad. Now, if this wasn't on Shabbos, if it was during the week, so what would you do? You would have to burn this Korban Pesach immediately, meaning somebody slaughtered this Korban Pesach, and it turns out that the group disbanded, and there's no group for it. So the Korban Pesach is possible, so you have to burn it immediately. So I understand if you talk a hold by akeera, that you need to uproot the original type of korban, right? And therefore, what are our options over here? So you have this animal that was a korban pesach, and it had a group of people associated with it, right? There were three options: either the owners died, or the group disbanded, or they became tameh. Let's just go with the group disbanding. So you have this korban pesach. It was set aside as a korban pesach, so it is a korban pesach. Now the group disbanded, so it's no longer a kosher korban pesach. Now we know mosar pesach karev shlam, right? As we've learned, that leftover korban pesachs can be offered as a korban shlamim. So therefore, once the group disbanded, so mistame, this korban pesach now becomes a korban shlamim. It's leftover korban pesach, it becomes a shlamim. Now the question is, do you have to specifically make it now into a korban shlamim, or does it on its own become a korban shlamim? So from the fact that we're saying that if the group disbanded, if it was during the week, you would burn it immediately. Well, why should you burn it immediately? If it's a shlamim, what's about the worst that could be? Well, since it was Erev Pesach, so it was already after the Korban Talmud Shel Bein Arbaim, so, maybe it's a problem, but it's not an inherent problem in the, mos of the animal. It would just be a technical problem, in which case you wouldn't burn it. You would have what's called ibur tzura that we've learned about in the past, that you would just kind of like let it hang out at the, like the bottom of the mizbeach, or maybe if it's an animal somewhere else, but until the morning, and then it becomes possible lina, and you would burn it then. So from the fact that we're saying that you can burn it immediately because it's psulo begufo, because there's something inherently wrong with this animal, must mean that it's remaining a korban pesach, and because the group disbanded, it's a korban pesach that doesn't have any group for it, and therefore it's a possible korban pesach. In the animal itself becomes possible, and that's why you can burn it immediately. So if you say by akeera, so it remains a pesach, and I understand why you'd burn it immediately. If you say lo by akeera, so then memele it should become a shlamim. And therefore, why should you burn it immediately? You should have to wait until the next morning and let it become possible lina, and then burn it then. Right? So, right, akeera. I understand if you say that you need an akeera in order to make it a shlamim. So, hai pesachu. So then this korban remains a pesach. And since at this point there are no longer any owners, right? The group disbanded. Havle psula begufo. Well, then that's a problem inherent in the animal itself, on the korban itself, and that's why you're going to burn it immediately. But if you say, like Rav was saying, that lo akeera, that memele, when the group disbands, it becomes a shlamim. Well then, mireisha avale shlamim. Well then, immediately when they disbanded it, it automatically became a shlamim. So psula mishum mai. So then, what's wrong with the situation right now? What's the problem with the fact that this pesach that doesn't have any group was slaughtered? Mishum davar acher. It's for some other reason that would make it possible. Because at this point it's a shlamim. What's the problem with the shlamim? Well, because the korban pesach is slaughtered, as we know, after the korban talmud shel bein arbaim. Now we know that aleh hashlim is kol korbanos kulam, that you don't offer any korbanos after the talmud shel bein arbaim, Pesach being an exception. So because you slaughtered this korban shlamim after the korban talmud shel bein arbaim, so therefore it's a problem, but ibur tzura, but it's not inherent in the animal itself. It's more of a technicality, and therefore you should just have to let it hang out until the morning, let it become possible lina, and then burn it. But from the fact that we're mamish burning it immediately means that it's a psul beguf, which means that it remains a korban pesach, which means by akeera. You'd have to specifically uproot the pesach from it and make it a shlamim. Titania, as we learn in the Brisa, says shepsula begufo yisarif miyad, because the rule is that if it's a psul haguf, if it's inherent in like the korban itself, so then you burn it immediately b'damu v'bailim. But if the problem is related to the blood or related to the owners, which Tosfos asks, well, isn't by this Pesach it related to the owners, because after all the owners disbanded? Whatever, we're not going to get into that. So then you just wait for it. Literally, it means for it to sort of change the appearance of its face, but to change form. But it essentially means lina. You leave it off of the mizbeach overnight; it becomes possible lina, and you burn it the next day. So we see that from the fact that we're saying that if you slaughtered this animal and then it turns out that the group disbanded and it was during the week, you would burn it immediately. Must mean that it's a psul beguf korban, and therefore, in order for that to be the case, it would have to be a Pesach, not a shlamim. Which means that it's still a Pesach because by akeera, in order to make it a shlamim, you would have to mamish designate it as a shlamim. So lotema shachto stam kosher l'shum ola. So rather, let's go back to the statement of Rav Huna in the name of Rav. Don't say that if you have this asham, that the owners offered some other animal as the asham instead. And then this initial asham, if you slaughter stam, it can be used as in olas ketzim mizbeach, which would imply that lo by akeera, that just on its own it became in olas ketzim mizbeach, even though you didn't do anything. But we see from the fact that you burn the korban pesach, that right that you immediately burn this korban pesach that the owners, that the group disbanded. So we see by akeera. So therefore, we're going to say that by the case of the asham, so don't say that you slaughtered it stam, rather say that you specifically slaughtered it for it to be a olas ketzim mizbeach, and that is why it can be offered as an olas ketzim mizbeach, because you uprooted the asham status and made it in olas ketzim mizbeach status. Rather, let's say if you specifically slaughtered this asham with so that it will be in olas ketzim mizbeach, then it is kasher alma by akeera. So we see that you specifically do have to uproot the initial status. What about Reb Chia bar Gamda? The Amar, who said in Daf Samach Daled Amar Aleph, Nizrika mipi bahabura ve'amrei, that the group, that like the bahabura, the group of students who were learning, unanimously agreed, and they said, Kigon shahayu bailim tmei mesim v'nitchen lepesach sheni. That it's talking about where the owners were tmei meis, and this animal was going to be for Pesach Sheni. What are we talking about? If you could remember back 10 days, nearly 10 days, to Daf Samach Daled Amar Aleph. So it was going on the Mishnah where Reb Shimon said that if you, during Chol HaMoed, if during the rest of the Chag, you slaughter a Korban Pesach with the intention of it being a Korban Pesach, right? Meaning Korban Pesach has to be offered on the 14th of Nisan. But if during the rest of Pesach you slaughtered this animal that you had set aside to be a Korban Pesach as a Korban Pesach, and in addition you have chametz at home, so you will not violate the prohibition of los tishchat al chametz dam zivchi, because this isn't shchita, because it's possible. You're not allowed to slaughter a Korban Pesach as a Korban Pesach on any day of the year other than the 14th. However, the Mishnah had said that if you slaughter this animal that was your Korban Pesach as a shlamim during the rest of Pesach, and you have chametz at home, so you're going to be violating the lav of lo tishchat al chametz dam zivchi. Now, the diuk that the Gemara wanted to make over there was that, yes, specifically, if you slaughter this Korban Pesach, or this animal that you had designated as a Korban Pesach, if you specifically slaughter it as a shlamim during the rest of Pesach, then you're going to be violating the prohibition of lo tishchat al chametz dam zivchi. However, if you slaughter it stam, well, then you would be potter. The assumption, the implication being that unless you specify that this korban that you had set aside as a Pesach, you want to now slaughter as a shlamim, unless you specify that specifically, it will remain a korban Pesach. And if you slaughter it just stam on Chol HaMoed, you're going to be potter, because you're shechting a korban Pesach, the shem korban Pesach, on some other day of the year, and therefore it's not going to be shchita, it's going to be possible, and you will not be violating los tishchat al chametz dam zivchi. So what do we see from there? That by akeera, right? that unless you specifically slaughter this initial Pesach as a shlamim, it remains a Pesach, and that's why you're pater. So by akeera. So then Reb Chia bar Gamda said, no. Really low by akeera. Really, memela, a korban Pesach becomes a korban shlamim on its own. Well then, how come over here we seem to be saying that it remains a Pesach? He says, well, because this is specifically talking about a situation where the owners of the korban Pesach became tmei meis, and therefore they were going to be doing Pesach Sheni, and therefore they were planning to still use this korban on Pesach for their Pesach Sheni. That's why it remained a korban Pesach. But in general, we would say lo by akeera, and it would automatically become a shlamim. Okay, fine. That was sort of like a roundabout. We had to kind of reference what we learned a week and a half ago, but the point being that according to Reb Chia bar Gamda, apparently the maskan of the Gemara over there seemed to be saying that lo by akeera, that on its own the Pesach would become a shlamim. The reason why it remained a Pesach in this case is because the people became tamid. They were going to use this animal as their Pesach Sheni. But in general, by default, we would say lo by akeera, that on its own the Pesach would become a shlamim. So what do we do with that, right? Because in the context of our Gemara, Rav Huna said in the name of Rab a statement that seemed to be saying lo by akeera. Then we brought a question based on the fact that we burn the korban Pesach that the group disbanded, that it must mean by akeera. So then we changed Rav Huna Marav to say, okay, fine, you specifically have to shech the shlam, the asham, the shem, all eskeitz mizbeach. So fine, we're going to agree by akeera. But what about Rav Chia bar Gamda, who seemed to conclude 10 days ago that by default lo by akeera, it would memela the Pesach would become a shlamim. So how does that fit into things? Right? So the Reb Chia bar Gamda, the Amanizuka mipi bahabura ve'amrei, kigon shahayu bailim tmei meisim, v'nitchel Pesach Sheni. So Reb Chia bar Gamda, who said 10 days ago that the reason why a korban Pesach, you would specifically have to shecht it as a shlamim in order to be over on Nosishchat HaChametz Dam Zivchi if you have Pesach at home. That's specifically because this is talking about a korban Pesach that the owners were tamrei and they were still planning to use the same korban for their Pesach Sheni. So hayu debai akeera. So specifically in that case, you have to have akeera because it's still a Pesach. Haba alma, but in general, lo by akeera. You wouldn't require akeera. It would memela become a shlamim. Michael Meimar. So how does that fit into things? The assumption there seems to be lo by akeera. So, but then again, if you say lo by akeera, then how does that fit into where we say that the korban Pesach that the group disbanded, if you slaughter it, you could burn it immediately because it's a psul aguf. But if we say lo by akeera, then memela shouldn't have been a shlamim and should need ibur tzura. So elam Rav Huna breder of Yoshua, hachab ma'eskinu kegon shefrisho kodem chatzos. So it says Rav Huna breder of Yoshua, okay, fine. So really we'll say lo by akeera, and an animal memela becomes a different type of korban. And therefore, in the case of the korban Pesach, we would say that if you slaughter a korban Pesach, and then it turns out that the group disbanded, so memela it should become a shlamim. Okay, well then how come you're going to burn it immediately? Well, hachab ma'eskinan, here what we're talking about by the korban Pesach is kigon shefrishu kodem chatzos, that you had a group and they had set aside before chatzot, before noon, they had set aside this animal to be their korban Pesach. Umeisu ba'alam acher chatzos, and then the owners died. Okay, so not necessarily disbanded, but in this case we're going to say the owners died after chatzos. Dehavale nir v'nidche. So it's a case of nir v'nidche, someone that's fit and then gets pushed off, meaning when the group designated this animal as a korban Pesach, so they were, all was good. It was going to be a korban Pesach. Now after chatzos, once already the zman shchitas korban Pesach begins, the owners died. So now you have this korban Pesach that's fit to be a korban Pesach, but now the owners died. So now it's no longer fit. So it's what's called nir v'nidche. It was fit and then it becomes pushed off, becomes unfit. Nir v'nidche, and whenever you have a situation of something that was fit and then becomes unfit, shuv eno chosev v'nireh, it can no longer become fit again. So then Rav Huna bar Yeshua wants to argue that is why you burn this Korban Pesach, that I guess in this case we want to say that the owners died, that you would burn it immediately. It's not because of akeera. No, it's because of a different technicality, which is, technically speaking, it's nira v'nidche and shuvenu nira, and it's a psul aguf, and you can burn it immediately. But the Gemara says that's not a good answer, because midi utaima ela l'Rav. 1 second. Who are we explaining over here? We're explaining the opinion of Rav, right? Rav Huna said in the name of Rav that if you have this asham that you shechted it stam with the intention of an olah, it makes sense. No, you shechted it stam, so you can use it as an olas ketz mizbeach, meaning that lo akeera. So that's Rav's opinion of lo akeera. Now, how could you be explaining this ukimta by the Korban Pesach in order to make sense of what Rav said of lo akeera, to be saying that by the Korban Pesach it's talking about nira v'nidche? Rav himself says that live animals do not get nidche. So this concept of nira v'nidche wouldn't apply here, wouldn't apply to a live animal that you had set aside before chatzos and then the owners died after chatzos. Since the animal's alive, nira v'nidche wouldn't apply. So therefore it doesn't make sense to explain, a Gemara that's trying to understand Rav's opinion by saying something that's against what Rav himself holds. So Elam Rav Papa. So rather says Rav Papa, Hamani Rabbi Eliezer hi. Domer b'chein ashochet achem l'shem Pesach pasul. Davle psula b'gufo. So says Rav Papa that, okay, really, yes, lo akeera. Okay, so if we say lo akeera, so then memele, the animal should become a shlamim, right? The answer is yeah, that's correct. Let's go back to our initial example that we've been using, that the group disbanded. So once the group disbands, it becomes a shlamim. And when the owner slaughters this, when the person who slaughters the korban slaughters it, it's already a shlamim. The problem is that the person slaughtering the animal doesn't know that it's a shlamim. So he's basically slaughtering a shlamim, the shem Pesach. And Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is that if you slaughter a shlamim, the shem Pesach, it's pasul. And therefore, because it's psula b'gufo, that's why you're going to burn it immediately. So let's read it again. This brisa, which says that during the week, if you slaughter this Korban Pesach, and then it turns out that the group had disbanded, so you would burn it immediately because it's psula b'gufo. Well, that's specifically Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. The Amar who said, Pesach pasul, that if you slaughter a shlamim with the intention of a Korban Pesach, on Erev Pesach it's pasul. So here, the person slaughtering this Korban Pesach was slaughtering it as a Korban Pesach. He didn't know that the group disbanded. So Memele was already, because the group disbanded, it was already a shlamim, because lo akeera. But the person slaughtering it was slaughtering it as a Pesach, so you're slaughtering a shlamim, the shem Pesach, and it's going to be pasul according to Rabbi Eliezer, to have a psula b'gufo, and it is a psula guf. Because you're slaughtering the shlamim as a Pesach, it's a psula b'gufo, and therefore you sarif miyad. But the Gemara says, but that doesn't make sense, because v'i Rabbi Eliezer hi chatas nami mechayev. But 1 second, if it's Rabbi Eliezer, our Mishnah had said that you'd be potter in this case, right? Meaning, our Mishnah said that if you slaughter a Korban Pesach on Shabbos, and then it turns out that the group disbanded, so you're potter. And on that we taught that but if it's during the week, you're going to burn it immediately. We want to say that, why are you going to burn it immediately during the week? Because it's Rabbi Eliezer who says that if you slaughter a shlamim, l'shem Pesach, it's pasul. But the thing is, Rabbi Eliezer would also say that if you did it on Shabbos, you'd be chayav a korban chatas. And over here in our Mishnah, is saying that it's potter, right? Rabbi Eliezer Torah b'dvar mitzvah potter. Rabbi Eliezer doesn't hold of the concept of Torah b'dvar mitzvah is potter. And therefore, you made a mistake, it was a shlamim, you shechted it l'shem Pesach. Rabbi Eliezer would say that you're chayav for that. And therefore, but our Mishnah is saying that if you slaughter this Korban Pesach and then it turns out that the group disbanded, you're going to be potter. So clearly then our Mishnah is not Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore then when we say that, and it was taught that if this same thing happened during the week, you're going to burn it immediately, that must also not be Rabbi Eliezer, because it was taught about the Mishnah. So if the Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer, then, or let's say the other way, if that is Rabbi Eliezer, then Memela the Mishnah would have to be Rabbi Eliezer, but clearly the Mishnah isn't Rabbi Eliezer because we're saying that he's Pater. So the Tirguma Rav Yosef Breder of Salah Chasida commented of Papa. So rather, Rav Yosef Breder of Salah Chasida explained it in front of Rav Papa. Hamani Yosef ben Chonaihi. And this seems to be the accepted answer, which is that who is the author of this brisa, which says that you burn it immediately, right? That during the week, if the owners disbanded this and the Korban Pesach was slaughtered, you would burn it immediately. It is Yosef ben Chonai. The Tanan, as we learn in the Mishnah, Yosef ben Chonai Omer Hanishchatim l'shem Pesach l'shem Chatas Psulim. That if you slaughter some other kind of korban with the intention of a korban Pesach or a korban Chatas, then they are psulim. So therefore here we say lo akeera, and memele, when the group disbanded, the Pesach becomes a shlamim. And now this fellow who slaughtered this animal was slaughtering a shlamim as a korban Pesach, and Yosef ben Chonai says that would be possible, and therefore because it's psula begufo, you have to burn it immediately. Psula begufo hi umshumachi sarf miyad uvivture savla kreb Yoshua. But Yosef ben Chonai, when it comes to Tabud Var Mitzvah, he holds like Rabbi Yoshua, that you'd be Pater. And therefore, on Shabbos, when you slaughter this animal, which is really a shlamim, and you're slaughtering it l'shem korban Pesach, so it's Tabud Var Mitzvah, and therefore you're going to be Pater, according to Yosef ben Chonai. But during the week, because it was you're shechting a shlamim with the intention of a korban Pesach, then it's going to be pasul, and it's psula b'gufo, and you're going to burn it immediately. And therefore, so where are we at? We're at that lo akeera, that when an animal sort of changes statuses, it changes statuses immediately. And therefore, the asham, memele, if you slaughter it, it can work as an olas ketz mizbeach. The korban Pesach, when the group disbands, memele becomes a shlamim. You don't have to do anything. And the reason why we say that you're going to burn it immediately if it's during the week is because you're slaughtering a shlamim, because it became a shlamim immediately. You're slaughtering it the shem korban Pesach, and it's like Yosef ben Chonai who says that it's psula begufo, and therefore you're going to burn it immediately. Rav Ashi Amar, says Rav Ashi, Rav Amar Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. Okay, Rav Ashi wants to argue that Rav, who says lo akeera, holds like Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. What does he say? The Tanya, as we learn in the Brisa. Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka Omer im yeshoz bayom leida mashchu ba'alim sedeim, that if there would be enough time during the day to know to do some research and figure out if the owners had abandoned the Korban Pesach, or shemesu, or maybe they died, or shenitmu, or maybe they became tamei, chayiv. Well, in that case, you'd be chayiv. So if you're shechting Korban Pesach on Shabbos, and there was still enough time in the day to do research to find out if, in fact, the group disbanded, and then you didn't do the research and you slaughtered it, and it turns out that the group disbanded, you actually are going to be chayiv, or korban chatas. And if it's during the Sefer, now, if it was during the week, however, so then we would say that don't burn it immediately, rather just let it go to the base. Rather, let it wait overnight and then take it out to burn it. My timer, how come if it's during the week, would you not burn it immediately? Rather, you would, let it wait overnight and then burn it. Is it not because of like what Rav is saying, that lo akeera, that memele, the Pesach became a shlamim, and because it became a shlamim, so since you were slaughtering it after the Tamid Shel Bein Arbayim, it's no good, but it's not really psula begufo, so to uber tzura, kilo that whole thing. So Rav Ashi wants to say that Rav, who says lo akeera, says like Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, who he wants to argue, also says lo akeera, and memele, the Pesach becomes a shlamim, and that is why he says that you need to let it wait overnight, and you can only burn it the next day. So the Gemara answer is Mimai. Rav Ashi, who says that Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka necessarily is saying that it requires Ibr Tzura because of lo akeera. Dilma, maybe the reason why he's saying that it requires Ibur Tzura is Mishum Desavrla Ketanadve Rabbi Baravua. Maybe Rabbi Shmuel ben Oshua Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka holds like was taught in the base medrash of Rabbi Baravua. The Amar Afilu Pigol Nami by Ibur Tzura, that even Pigol, even Psula Begufo requires Ibur Tzura. The Yolef Avon Min Noser, that you learn out Avon from Noser, right? That meaning, so it could be that Rabbi Shmuel ben Oshua Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Taka holds Ba'i akeera, and therefore it remains a Korban Pesach, and therefore the Psul is Psula Begufo. Well then why does he say that to Uber Tzura and not Yisarif Miyad? Well, because maybe he holds like they taught by the base medrash of Rabbi Baravua that even things like Pigol, even things that are Mamish Psula Begufo, you have Ibur Tzura, you don't burn immediately. Because if you don't say like this, Nitmu Bailim Ma'ikil Meimar. Because in a situation of Nitmu Bailim, right, because Rabbi Shmuel ben Oshua Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka said that in all three cases, right, if whether the owners became Tamei, whether the owners died, whether the group disbanded, in all three cases, if there was time to research it during the day, and you didn't, so then we'll say that you're going to be Chayav Korban Chatas on Shabbos, and if it was during the week, you're going to have Ibur Tzura. Now, if it was Nitmeu Bailim, right, that they became Tamei, well then, if we're saying that it's a matter of what's it called, lo by akeera, that it doesn't need an akeera, and therefore Memela it became a shlamim, and because it became a shlamim, that's why we're saying Ibur Tzura. But what about in the case of when they became tamei? When they became tamei, so it remains a korban pesach because they're going to use it for pesach sheni. So Michael Mimra Habadai by akeera. In the situation of where they became tamei, certainly it would remain a korban pesach until you designate it as something else. Because after all, Rav Chia bar Gamda said that the situation 10 days ago, where we say Baya Akeera, was specifically because since the owners were Tamei, and they were going to bring a Pesach Sheni, it remains a Korban Pesach. So in that case, it wouldn't be an issue of, right, we wouldn't be able to apply Lo Baya Akeera. In that case, Dafka Baya Akeera. So the Machbar Tikid Shadi Meikar Yosef ben Chunayhi, rather it makes sense, like we initially said, which is that, like Rav Yossi ben Chunai, that we could say Lo Baya Akeera, and the Pesach Memela becomes a Shlamim, but the thing is that he shechted it, a Shlamim, the Shem Pesach, that's why it's Psula Begufa, that's why you Sarif Miyad. Don't bring a proof from that, don't try to say that Rabbi Shmuel ben Oshua Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka holds Lo Baya Akeera like Rav. Wow, that was a complex page, right? Like you really had to move slowly there on Daf Ayin Gimel, but Daf Ayin Dalet I think should be a little bit easier, which is nice. So that was Daf Ayin Gimel. So at the beginning we discussed like Mekalkel bahabura, that the question was when you slaughter the Korban Pesach on Shabbos, let's say Shalola Ochlav or something, like what's if you say Mekalkel bahabura, that if you make a wound, but you're only damaging, you're not creating any positive value, so then you're going to be potter. What positive value is over here? Why is it going to be chayiv? So we explained, because the korban, once the emurim go to the mizbeach, they don't take them down. We kind of explained how whenever you're going to be chayiv in these cases, it's always going to be sort of a positive outcome. And then we got up to this really big sugya of Baya Akeera, right? That Rav seems to be saying Lo Baya Akeera. And the general vibe, the general conclusion seems to be in accordance with Rav, that when you have an animal, and it's one kind of animal, and for whatever reason, right, one kind of korban, and for whatever reason it becomes a different kind of korban, that change happens automatically. You don't actually have to specifically change it. It happens kind of automatically. We saw that in the case of Rav, when you had an asham, that for whatever reason you offered a different asham instead. So now what happens to the first one? So the first one, automatically, if you just kind of slaughtered it, without any specific intention, you can use it for all askets mizbeach. We saw in the case of a korban pesach that if the group disbanded, or the owners died, or everybody became tamei, so then, well, maybe not in the case of where it became tamei, that would probably be more complicated, but because it would remain a Pesach, but otherwise, memele it becomes a shlamim, and if you slaughter it l'shem Pesach, it's going to be psula begufo, and you sarif miyad, you're going to burn it immediately. So that was essentially the maskana that we got to. Along the way, we had other types of hukimtas, but they were rejected. Let's leave it at that. Okay, well, that was Daf Ayin Gimel. Hope you enjoyed it. Peace out.